Warning, Gory Storytime is a horror movie review show with a 13-year-old host. So, if you are not amused by the idea of a child describing R-rated graphic scenes of violence and death, or do not want movies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s spoiled, this may not be the show for you. Parental guidance is suggested.
Yeah, so guide your parents out of the room so we can have some fun. Welcome to Gory Storytime. I'm your host, Jason.
And I'm his co-host, Craig. I'm also his father. And the idea for this show is we're going to review horror movies from the 70s, the 80s, 90s, and see them through the perspective of a younger person. I grew up loving them, and by the time you were, the first? Five. He watched his first horror movie, and because he handled it well without having nightmares or anything, slowly I let him watch scarier and scarier films, and they tend to be his favorite kind of movie. And what movie are we going to review today, in case people can't see the picture behind us and figure it out on their own?
A Nightmare on Elm Street.
Starring Robert Englund, put out by New Line Cinema. And before we get too far, let's watch the trailer.
The kids of Elm Street don't know it yet, but something is coming to get them.
There's something out there, isn't there?
We could just see cuts happening.
What did that, Lieutenant?
I don't know.
What's the coroner got to say? He's in the John puking since he saw it.
They're gonna kill me for sure.
Did you do it?
There was somebody else there.
He was locked in a room with a girl who went in alive and came out in a rubber bag.
No one knows where it came from or who it will visit next.
Nancy? There's something wrong with you. You're imagining things.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Do you believe in the boogeyman?
No.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
No!
She's the only one who can stop it. If she fails,
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
no one will survive. From Wes Craven, director of The Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left, a new masterpiece in fantasy terror, Nightmare on Elm Street.
All right. Well, so let's give the people a basic summary of the story of Nightmare on Elm Street.
Fred Krueger, a child murderer, was caught and the papers weren't filed right, so they let him go.
And then the parents in town got together and decided that they would do some vigilante justice. They hunted him down to the boiler room where he worked and set him on fire. And when he died, he now has some strange new abilities.
And he now kills their children while they sleep.
And by that, he means in their dreams. If he kills you in your dreams, you die. It's for real. The story also is about this girl named Nancy who lives on Elm Street. And she's the first one you really see having these nightmares. Was Tina's the first?
Yeah,
Tina's was the first. I think you're right.
It started with Tina.
Yes.
And then she told Nancy about the dream.
And like many classic horror movies, the girl who does not have sex or do drugs or drink is the one who lives. And spoiler alert, she's the only one who doesn't drink, do drugs, or have sex. Well, or her boyfriend, but unfortunately, well, we'll get into that later. She's the good girl. They always do that in these horror movies. They love to,
have a good girl and not have them die.
Yeah. It's like the classic fairy tale thing where the person who does the bad things in the end gets punished. And Freddy would be the punishment in this version of that.
Yes.
Well, I know we have talked over, after watching the movie, some interesting facts about Nightmare on Elm Street, so let's share some of those.
Wes Craven, when he was a child, about my age, his bully's name was Fred Krueger. Changed the spelling so they wouldn't have a lawsuit or something like that, but
basically the name of this character came from, yep, absolutely. Also, when he was, I think he said 12 or 13, so about your age, his parents had left him home alone because back in that day, you didn't pay for a babysitter. Why would you do that when the kid can be home by themselves with the door locked? It's not like anyone was going to break in and kidnap, because that just wasn't something people thought about at the time. And he was scared and was looking out the window as a older homeless gentleman was walking by wearing a red and green sweater and a fedora, very similar to what you see Freddy wearing. He also, from that distance, seemed like his face was burnt. Maybe he had, some sort of, acne problem, like who knows. But from his young age and his point of view, he thought that he looked burnt, and they made eye contact. And for some reason, this fine, upstanding gentleman decided, I'm going to scare the living crap out of this child. So he ran up to the door and started pounding on it and screaming. And he kept doing it for about an hour. And he left not long before Wes's parents came home. But that image had stayed with him his whole life. And that's where the basic look of Freddy came from. And of course, the other true story that inspired Freddy would be?
He had seen 3 different news stories, separate occasions. Each of them were teenagers scared to go to sleep with coffee pots. One of them had a coffee pot in their closet because they thought someone or something in their dream was going to kill them. After a while or whatever of them not wanting to go to sleep, their parents said, oh no, it's okay, you're not going to die in your sleep. And then they ended up dying in their sleep.
And the doctors pretty much have no explanation for why they died. They didn't have a history of heart problems. They were young, they were teenagers, There was nothing that explained why they died. And, well, Wes Craven said, I wonder if there could be an idea of something in the dreams actually killing you, and if you die, you actually die for real. So those 3 true stories put together made the story, the fictional story, absolutely, of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Also, New Line at first was a little worried that anyone was going to actually be afraid of it, because if it's in a dream, they were worried people were going to watch it and say, well, if it's in a dream, it's not real, so there's nothing to actually be scared of. Obviously, those people were incorrect, because there was 6 more direct sequels, then a Freddy vs. Jason crossover sequel, and a remake of the original, which I don't even want to talk about, because when compared to Robert Englund in this,
not good.
Not at all. Also, you were telling me about how one of the co-stars, this was his first film, so why don't you share that with the audience?
This was Johnny Depp's first feature film. It kick-started him off
to a huge
after,
career.
Yeah, to a huge career, but after 21 Jump Street.
Well, 21 Jump Street came just prior to this movie, but yeah, I mean, now, you know, with movies like the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Lone Ranger, which not that great or whatever to some reviewers, but the fact is, I mean, he's worked with Disney and Tim Burton repeatedly, and he's got a pretty good history, you know. Edward Scissorhands.
He reappeared in one of the Freddy movies as a guest star.
Yeah, he cameoed in the Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, in a parody of a commercial, which, by the way, reminds me. Let me get the commercial so I make sure that the copy is read correctly. Gory Story Time is brought to you by Stay Awake Caffeine Pills. Stay awake for when you're absolutely dead tired. Side effects may include dry eyes, rash, oily discharge, and in rare cases, spontaneous combustion. And also brought to you by...
And by Fred E. Harmony, an online dating site. Ladies, you can find the man of your dreams at Fred E. Harmony.
All right. Now, let's talk about our favorite scenes in the movie. And here's definitely a part where there will be spoilers. But, you know, warning, when talking to a 13-year-old about movies, they have a hard time not spoiling things. So if you don't want to hear spoilers, this might not be something you want to hear. But what would you say your favorite scene in the movie was?
It would have to be with Johnny Depp, when he was told to stay awake by Nancy and come and meet her on her porch. He fell asleep and got sucked into his bed and sprayed onto the ceiling, and the cops had to come up and mop him off the ceiling.
That was a pretty gory and disturbing scene. Special effects being what they were at the time, it was actually pretty impressive, I thought. The fact that, you know, by the way, speaking of facts, they used a rotating room for 2 scenes in that, and I'm about to say my favorite scene, and it's the other one with the rotating room. What they did was they had a room built, it was his bedroom, and they could actually spin the entire room upside down. That's how they made it look like the blood was hitting the ceiling. It was actually falling to the floor, and then they just had the camera upside down filming that. So they were actually dumping blood. You know, gravity was going to pull it down, but because the room was upside down at the time, it looked like it was floating to the ceiling. They also used the rotating room for my favorite scene, which is where Tina, Nancy's friend, was in bed with her boyfriend, and she was having a nightmare, but he was awake, so he couldn't see Freddy Krueger, but he did see cuts appearing on her, saw her thrashing around with someone on her, and then being dragged up the wall and on the ceiling all bloody. And the way they did that was they slowly rotated the room as they dragged her. It was actually just across the floor, but the floor kept being the new wall and then the ceiling, but it looked, when they had the camera locked in place, like they were pulling her up onto the ceiling. So they used that device a couple of times, and I actually think the special effects, because it was the early 80s, were pretty decent considering they didn't have CGI like now, you know. Everything had to be... Yeah. Why don't you speak about that?
Freddy, above Nancy's head, came through the wall and was going to probably grab her, but then she woke up and he...
I mean, you could see his face outline as it stretched through the wall, and they had used, you know, some kind of rubber or whatever for him to push through that looked like the wall. And, you know, as he went through, you could see his face get clearer and clearer and his claws coming out towards her. When they remade the Nightmare on Elm Street movie with a different actor, they tried to redo that scene. And with the digital effects, honestly, it didn't look as good or as realistic as the practical effect they used in the 80s. I was very disappointed with the remake, which is why that's not a movie that we ever intend to review on this show. Just not good. And I'm not against all remakes. I actually thought the remake of Halloween by Rob Zombie was pretty good, but that'll be for another show.
And the Jason one. Yeah, but the phone.
Oh, yes.
With the tongue.
Well,
Someone had
describe
to
it.
put the clay or whatever they used to make it onto the phone, and every split second had to change it or
Well, no,
whatever.
I think with the tongue, I believe that was more of a robotic kind of thing, like a remote control tongue to have it move.
But they had to put the clay
Oh, yeah. to
or
build
whatever
it
around the
Absolutely.
mouth part of the phone.
And, again, it's kind of humorous that the digital effects in the remake
Doesn't look as
didn't
real.
stand up quality-wise to some of the practical effects that they used in the 80s. A lot of car crashes are that way in older movies. The fact is, when it's all done CGI, they can do it now where it looks more realistic, but there's just so many times where if they don't put enough hours into it, it just doesn't look right. And, since the beginning of films, they were always using actual cars actually flipping end over end, and they would actually put an explosive in so it would actually explode. They had stuntmen. Now they don't have to use stuntmen as much because of digital, but it really doesn't look the same. So what would you say your least favorite scene in the original Nightmare would be?
It would have to be when, near the beginning,
I believe it
was Tina's, no, it was Nancy's dream.
Yeah.
He extended his arms to like 20 feet long. It just didn't look real. It didn't seem...
They kind of accordioned and just,
Yeah, it was just weird.
That was one effect that did not play well.
No.
I would have to say, not so much a scene that I would say is my least favorite. I would say it's the score, the music for it. It was really loud, synthesized
80s
music, but the volume, that they didn't level it very well. So, I mean, as you noticed when we were watching it recently to prepare for this, it was really, really loud, screaming synthesizers.
So we had to turn it down.
And then the people would talk like this and be really quiet, and we couldn't hear what they were saying. And it's kind of, it's like I don't want to have to sit there when I'm watching a movie and crank up the volume to hear the people talk, crank down the volume because Freddy jumped out and it goes, "Rawr!" and it has like this. Just, they didn't level it very well. I understand having some sound effects be louder than others, but the music, the synthesized sounds of the 80s were just too loud. So one thing I wanted to do on this show was talk about the body count, because horror movies get a bad rap for, it's die, 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 murder, murder, murder. But actually, in the original Nightmare on Elm Street, how many people actually were killed?
4.
4. And then with one of the alternate endings, you're not even sure if any of them died or if the whole thing was a dream. They played it off like maybe no one died. The sequels wouldn't have worked that way. You have to.
Without all those players.
Someone has to actually die.
Yeah.
But I think that the fact that I've seen plenty of war movies, Scarface, which is a great movie, many more people die than Nightmare on Elm Street, I think more people died in Forrest Gump when he was in Vietnam than died in this, More people have died in the Star Wars movies than in Nightmare on Elm Street, the original. I mean, the body count does get higher later in the series. Which tends to be the case with a lot of horror movies, is they don't start off with a slaughter fest most of the time. But, I mean, there was actually only 4 deaths total in this film. So before we end, I would say, what would you say you would rate this on a scale of 1 to 10?
I'd say 7.
And why would you say 7?
Because it's not the best movie, but it's not the worst movie. So,
But it seems to be on the higher end for
yeah,
you?
it's one of the better ones.
All right. What do you think they could have done to change it that would have made you want to say a higher number?
One would be also near the beginning, along with the stretch arms, have a better looking skull under the face when they ripped it off. Or,
Well, to be fair, I believe this was the first New Line Cinema movie, and they really didn't have a lot of money to do it. So the special effects that they did
were really good.
For the money that they had, they did the best they could. That's why there is a couple of things that didn't. But you notice the special effects do get better in some of the sequels.
Yes.
Because they have money to put into it. And like I said, that money turned around and, did a whole bunch. I mean, Dumb and Dumber was New Line Cinema.
The Mask.
Yeah, and we mentioned Ninja Turtles, So a lot of family entertainment owes its thanks to Nightmare on Elm Street money. Which is why I'm surprised that they're still kind of hanging on to the Freddy thing, because they seem to have pushed towards more family-friendly stuff.
Yeah.
But every once in a while you hear, oh, well, they're remaking Nightmare on Elm Street like they had done, They also had purchased the rights to the Friday the 13th series, which is why they were the ones who made Jason Goes to Hell. So I guess they're keeping some of their roots in horror.
Yeah, because they remade the Jason movie.
Yep. And, well, when that remake, they did it with Paramount for some reason, because it was based on some of the older scripts of the first 4 Friday the 13th movies. But we can get more into that when we review
do one of
those. So I would rate this movie an 8 out of 10, but the reason I give it a little higher is, for me, I was your age when I was watching these, when, I probably started watching them in like 4th grade, and I watched them as they came out. And honestly, I look at the whole series, and that's where I get my 8. It's my favorite horror series of all. I like the Jason movies, I like the Chucky movies, but if I had to pick one as my favorite all-time series, it would be Nightmare on Elm Street, including New Nightmare, which some people don't count, some people do, because it's not really in the
Freddy movie.
Right. But it wouldn't exist without the Nightmare on Elm Street. Is there anything else that you would like to say?
Well, this was our first episode of Gory Storytime. I was your host, Jason.
And I was his co-host, Craig, and sweet dreams.
Sweet dreams.